Welcome back to Alpha Recap. I'm glad you're with us after the close. I'm Kristen, and joining me is Drew, our curious tech sector analyst. As always, if you have questions about anything we cover, you can reach us at stockalpha.ai. Ready to unpack the day?
Absolutely. Plenty to talk about. Infrastructure moves, chiplet consortiums, and a big defense spending narrative that showed up in the headlines.
Let's start with the semiconductor and data center news. Montage Technology announced it was shipping an active electrical cable that supports PCI Express version 6 and CXL version 3. Drew, why is that a big deal?
In plain terms, this is a physical product that helps connect racks and nodes at much higher speeds. Think of it as upgrading the highway between data center buildings. PCI Express 6 and CXL 3 raise how much data you can move and how flexibly compute resources can be shared. Having an active cable that ships now means hyperscalers and big OEMs can start building systems around these standards sooner rather than later.
So it's not just a standards announcement. It's actual hardware hitting the market. That feels concrete.
Exactly. Standards without interoperable hardware are just theories. This is the physical layer that lets those higher-level fabrics actually perform in real systems.
Speaking of coordinated pushes, Tenstorrent joined Chassis, the European Union-led consortium focused on software-defined mobility and chiplet designs. What's the significance of that consortium?
Chassis is a 3-year R&D program, which matters because it lays out a roadmap, demos, prototypes, reference designs. Tenstorrent's participation signals a coordinated effort to move chiplets and software-defined compute into automotive use cases. In short, it's about partitioning compute differently and making it easier to update and manage in cars.
Chiplets. That term gets thrown around a lot. For listeners who aren't deep in semiconductor design, how would you describe chiplets and why they matter for automotive compute?
Good question. A chiplet approach breaks a big chip into smaller functional blocks, kind of like building with Lego pieces instead of one huge monolith. That lets designers mix and match processor cores, accelerators, and I/O more flexibly, which is attractive for cars because manufacturers want modularity, cost control, and easier updates. Combine that with strong interconnects like CXL, and you get composable compute that scales across domains: infotainment, driver assist, autonomy.
Putting Montage's cable and Tenstorrent and chassis together, the article said standards and products are converging. Did the market act on that today?
The market reaction was more thematic than concentrated in a single big name. We saw flows into suppliers that benefit from high-speed signaling, cable and connector makers, switch silicon vendors, and systems integrators. It also has implications for GPU and accelerator vendors that rely on multi-node bandwidth to scale workloads.
The chassis timeline being 3 years is interesting from an investor perspective. How should listeners track progress?
Track partner lists, demo milestones, funding tranches from the EU, and any customer design wins. Each demo or prototype can convert R&D participation into design wins, and those design wins are what eventually show up in revenue and supply chain orders.
Switching gears, the Vision Wave-backed release that framed global defense spending at about $2.7 trillion for 2024 got a lot of attention. What was the market takeaway there?
The headline pushed a thesis that elevated defense budgets and strategic M&A will underpin a roughly $2.7 trillion sector valuation. For investors, higher budgets mean multi-year revenue visibility for defense contractors and specialized tech suppliers. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and RTX were cited as natural beneficiaries to watch for contract awards or guidance changes.
You mentioned autonomy earlier as a crossover. How do defense budgets and autonomous systems interact with the chip and interconnect narrative?
There's clear spillover. The sensor fusion compute platforms and software stacks built for defense autonomy can also be commercialized into automotive and industrial markets. That increases demand for compute platforms, accelerators, and ultimately the interconnects that tie those pieces together. So defense procurement can accelerate commercial adoption indirectly.
Let's talk market flows and retail activity. The article highlighted heavy activity in a microcap called IEO, which climbed about 3% on heavy volume, roughly 124 million shares, and a triple short semiconductors ETF that jumped about 4% on very heavy volume, about 426 million shares. What does that tell us?
Those are classic signals of retail-driven momentum. When low-price stocks and leveraged ETFs see outsized volume, retail traders are engaged, and that can amplify intraday moves. It raises execution and volatility risk for bigger investors and often presages sharp short-term reversals as retail attention moves on.
Any practical advice for listeners who trade around that kind of action? There was also a quirky data point. A Google Trends spike for the query, "Where's my refund?" with about 20,000 US searches and a 100% increase. You had an interesting take on that.
Yeah, it's an early behavioral indicator. It doesn't prove spending will rise, but if people are checking refunds, it could hint at near-term liquidity shifts that could feed consumer spending. I'd watch upcoming cash flow prints or retail sales to see if that signal persists.
Other corporate moves today included PLT Health Solutions, hiring ahead for APAC Business Development, Gray attending a major industry expo, and a Shanghai company issuing a correction about a partnership claim. What's the through line there?
These are mostly execution and credibility stories. PLT's higher signals deliberate international expansion but doesn't change the revenue picture yet. Expo attendance is business development. Follow-on contracts matter. Corrections like the Shanghai PR fix are credibility watches. They can create short-term sentiment risk, especially for smaller names.
We should also mention the policy angle. Stanford released its Emerging Technology Review for 2026, laying out frontier technologies and policy areas. How does that fit into what we saw today?
Policy is increasingly material. Stanford's framing will influence lawmakers and agencies on disclosure, safety, and compliance. That can change costs and competitive dynamics for AI, defense, biotech, and infrastructure companies. The chassis consortium and standards upgrades will all be evaluated through that regulatory lens, especially around export controls and procurement transparency.
All right, let's zoom out. What patterns or trends emerged from today's briefs that investors should keep in mind?
3 big themes. 1. Infrastructure-first investments. We saw product launches and consortium R&D that point to a multi-year upgrade cycle for data centers and automotive compute. 2. Convergence of defense and commercial autonomy. Elevated defense budgets plus autonomous tech could spill into civilian markets. 3. Persistent retail-driven volatility, heavy volume in microcaps and leveraged ETFs remains a short-term risk for markets. And you should add a 4th. Policy matters more than ever. Stanford and EU-led initiatives will shape which technologies scale quickly.
Before we wrap, what are the concrete watch items for tomorrow and the near term?
Watch for chassis consortium updates, any partner list expansion, public milestone, or EU funding tranche. Look for Montage customer wins or interoperability demos tying its cable to real platforms and mentions of big ecosystem players. Keep an eye on official defense contract announcements or M&A activity that might validate the $2.7 trillion thesis and monitor the contractors' pipelines. Also track continued volume in names like IEO and that triple short semiconductors ETF. Persistent elevated activity would underscore retail momentum. Finally, look for any regulatory commentary that references the Stanford Review.
Great checklist. Let's finish with quick takeaways. Plain and useful for listeners who want to act or just keep these themes in mind.
First takeaway, the move to PCI Express 6 and CXL 3 is more than academic. Hardware like Montage's cable means real infrastructure upgrades are starting. Second, chiplets and consortiums like chassis suggest a multi-year roadmap for automotive compute. Follow partner lists and demos. Third, elevated defense spending supports contractors and specialized suppliers and could accelerate commercial autonomy tech. Fourth, retail-driven volume in microcaps and leveraged ETFs increases short-term volatility risk. Manage position sizes. Fifth, policy developments from institutions like Stanford and EU programs will shape who can scale and how quickly.
Perfect. Thanks, Drew. That was a clear walkthrough. And to everyone listening, if you have questions about anything we covered today, head to stockalpha.ai, where you can ask us directly and we'll answer live. For more market analysis and insights, visit stockalpha.ai. We'll be back after the next close. See you then.